Spices. What do you know about them and how are you using them in your day-to-day life and in your fantasy worlds? Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. On today's episode we'll be talking about spices and wrapping up this topic. Last week I mentioned that in my opinion there are two spices that have the bloodiest and goriest history of them all, nutmeg and cloves, but I actually failed to talk about cloves, so this is the topic of today's episode. I also realized that I mentioned that we'll be talking about what the British, the French and the Spanish were doing while the Dutch were busy conquering new territory, enslaving and exterminating local populations, but I realized that it doesn't really have to do a lot with spice trade, and as such we're not gonna touch upon the subject that much today. Don't worry, you know the drill, it's another story for another time, but I'm gonna give you a bit of a spoiler, and if this comes as a spoiler to you, I don't know what to say. Spoiler alert, they were busy conquering new territories, enslaving and exterminating populations in Africa and in the Americas. With that out of the way, let us talk about the miniature. Today I will be painting an Alfishni from WizKids. It is a quite large miniature in comparison to everything else that I painted on this channel thus far, and I will be honest, I wasn't that happy with the painting process. I know it's nobody else's fault but mine, but I still wasn't happy with it, and I'm still not, but in the end it turned out better than I expected. I don't know what happened, maybe I wasn't in the mood, maybe I didn't see it, it didn't speak to me, but I kinda struggled with this particular miniature. The result is acceptable and better than I hoped for. You will see what I'm talking about down the line. With that, let's get back to our spices and set the scene. Let's delve into the history of cloves just a little bit, and before we talk about the Middle Ages and the moment when Europeans really got involved in its trade, let us talk about its general properties and uses. If you ever came into contact with this particular spice, you know that it has a very strong, very permeating scent, it has a very long-lasting and strong aroma, and if you put one or two cloves in your mouth and leave them there for a second, you know it has a very interesting numbing effect. If you guess that among all its uses it also had a role in oral hygiene, then you are quite right, congratulations. With that out of the way, let us talk about a particular moment in history. In 200 CE, merchants from Java started trading the spice in China during the Han Dynasty, and slowly but surely it made its way rapidly among the nobility. One of its more intriguing uses was to freshen the breath right before addressing the emperor. You wouldn't want to offend the emperor with your garlic or your onion breath. As such, pop one or two in your mouth and you would be perhaps safe. Cloves were used for the longest of time, even to this day, to freshen the breath, to alleviate toothaches thanks to its numbing properties. It's used as an aphrodisiac, it is used to spice foods, and it is used in certain cases to preserve food. This is why cloves have such an important role to play in human history, because it was one of the most coveted spices out there. Before we continue and actually delve into the more bloody part of its history, let's all take a moment. You hit that like button while I talk about the miniature. Using Thin Down Baraknar Burundi, I'm adding shadows to different areas of the Nalfishni, on the chest, under the pectoral and in the palms of the hands. This adds more depth, and against the brownish skin it gives it a bit of a more natural look. With Abaddon Black I am adding a few more details to the fur on the lower parts of the belly, and with a thin down mix of Rhinox hide and Cadmian flesh tone I am adding some highlights to the head, face and chest. Welcome back, let's continue. As with Nutmeg, there were only a handful of isles that yielded cloves in the Middle Ages, and they were all found in the same region in Indonesia. If you haven't seen my previous video regarding nutmeg and the race to find its source, I recommend you do so because it explains a lot of what actually happened in that period in that region of the world. It explains what the Europeans were after, and it explains the approach that the Europeans had regarding the source of these spices. In the race to find the source of cloves, the Portuguese were the winners. The two largest isles that yield cloves are Ternate and Todor. Both of them were sultanates, both of them were very powerful, both of them were at war. Ternate was the strongest, the wealthiest and the most influential port in the area, as it is today. When the Portuguese first made their appearance with their fancy ships and their advanced weaponry and their riches, trinkets and garnets and everything, both sultans tried to garner their favor. Eventually, the Sultan of Ternate was the one who managed to convince the Portuguese to aid him in war. In exchange for weapons, he handed over the monopoly over Cloves trade for 50 years to the Portuguese. With the help of these powerful and very wealthy foreigners, the Sultan of Ternate managed to defeat his rival on Todor. At the beginning of this wonderful and very lucrative relationship, everybody was happy, everything was rosy and peachy. The Sultan was enjoying his victory and the control he had over his neighboring isles. He enjoyed his new weapons and his new very wealthy, very powerful foreign allies, while the Portuguese enjoyed monopoly over the clove trade, and they were allowed to construct a fortification on Ternate. But as you might imagine, things went sour really fast. After they established a fortified foothold on the isle, the Portuguese decided that they want total control and dominance over the Sultanate and the isles. This of course didn't sit that well with the people nor with the Sultan. As such, the Portuguese came up with a very brilliant idea. They kidnapped the Sultan. In 1570, they murdered him. This, of course, sparked a revolt. The local population tried to assault the fortification, but they failed. They didn't have advanced weaponry. But they did the next best thing. They laid siege to the fortification, blocking off every entrance and exit to the fortification, surrounding it. After 5 years, the Portuguese were forced out by starvation, they all surrendered, and the power and the influence that the Portuguese had in the area rapidly went up in flames. Before we continue with our story, let's talk about the miniature for a bit. Using a thin down mix of Abaddon Black and Dawnstone, I am adding highlights to the feathers of its wings, giving them a silkier look. I am moving back and forth with detailing between the wings and its mohawk until I'm happy with the results. Because the light source in my mind is coming from the front and to the right, I don't need nor will I highlight the wings in their entirety. Welcome back, let's continue. Once the Portuguese were dealt with and thrown out, the new Sultan sought out an alliance with the largest foreign power in the area. Unfortunately, that meant the Dutch. By this point, the Dutch had control over most of the isles in Indonesia. They also had control over a smaller isle called Ambuan that yielded cloves. But the Dutch really wanted to strangle the market, they really wanted to jack up the prices to astronomical levels, and they wanted to ensure that they have full and total control over the clove trade, as they were trying to do with the nutmeg trade. To that end, they decided that they had only one solution. They came up with a brilliant idea, and I sure as heck hope you can sense the sarcasm in my voice. They decided that the best way to implement this plan was to destroy all other sources of cloves with the exception of the isle that they already controlled, the small isle of Amboine. Of course, the Sultan wouldn't be convinced to do so. So they came up with a very deceitful, very well thought out and very cynical plan. They started a very intense, very aggressive, very well planned campaign of deceiving and persuading the Sultan and the main individuals involved in the clove trade. They started telling everyone that Europeans no longer wanted only cloves. No, they wanted whole branches, they wanted the bark of the clove tree, and they wanted the roots. Of course, this didn't sit that well with the Sultan and the farmers. But the Dutch had a very important tool that helped them a lot. They had a lot of money from the nutmeg trade. I hope you can see where this is going. They started throwing a buttload of money towards purchasing branches, towards purchasing bark and roots. Over a few short decades, there were no more clove tree on Ternate, on Todor, or anywhere else with the exception of Amboine. I have to give it to them, the Dutch were quite patient in their endeavor and quite devious, but it was a success. They had a chokehold over the clove trade and they can control the prices as they pleased. The only clove tree that survived on Ternate was one in the Sultan's own private gardens. And to this day, the inhabitants of Ternate strongly believe that all of the clove trees that can now be found again on the isle originate from that single tree. In the middle of the 18th century, the French managed to smuggle off of Amboine a few clove saplings and plant them in India and in the Americas, thus breaking the stranglehold that the Dutch had over the clove trade. And with that, let us take one more look at the miniature before we wrap things up. Using thinned down Fenrisian grey, I am adding more highlights to the mohawk and the wings, catching only the tips of the hairs and the tips of the feathers, until I'm happy with the results. It's looking pretty well. I am now moving on to painting the base black, as I plan on adding several layers of paint and a good coat of mordant earth for a cracked effect. Welcome back. We have reached the end of our story around spices and condiments, at least for now. And although there are so many more spices out there that have either a wonderful or a dark history that just awaits to be unraveled and be discovered and be included in your homebrewed worlds, we are going to revisit this topic at a later date. Until then, the next time you open your pantry to use any spice or any condiment, take a moment and think about the history behind them and about the people whose lives, for better or for worse, revolved around these spices throughout history. I truly hope you learned something new over the course of the past two videos, and I truly hope you found some inspiration, because although across the past two videos we discussed a darker period in human history and a darker side of human nature, these stories deserve to be known, these stories deserve to be remembered, and these stories deserve to be included in fantasy world, in my opinion at least. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I hope I see you all here next week on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers. Oh, one more thing before you go. I'm sure you noticed that the short story at the beginning of the video has been removed, at least for this week's episode. I don't plan on removing the short stories altogether, as I truly enjoy having an additional creative outlet that allows me to better flesh out my world, gives you a glimpse into my world, my campaign, into my mind. But I'm playing around with some ideas, I'm experimenting a little bit, and I've noticed that the short stories at the beginning of the video don't always properly reflect the topic of the video as I would wish them to. As such, I decided to implement a change. That change is very simple. I'm going to continue putting out the weekly video that is constructed around mini painting, history and world building, and I will put out a secondary episode, hopefully every week, constructed solely around the short story. A short story that is in connection with that week's video. Hopefully it's gonna work out. I don't know yet, we're gonna see together, but please feel free to tell me your thoughts around this down in the comments below, as I'm curious to know your opinion as well. Until next week, bye.